Hi, I'm Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce Communications Director Dan Smith. Now, recent events across our community and across the nation have brought the conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion to the forefront. Rochester Chamber recently joined a U.S. Chamber of Commerce initiative to address inequality of opportunity. Rochester Chamber's Senior Manager of Workforce Development and Education Initiative, Adrian Hale, joins me now with more on that. Adrian, give us a quick overview of the program. What is its goal? Who's participating in it?
So the purpose of Opportunity Initiative is to figure out what is it that business can do to identify, challenges that are keeping people of color, in particular Black Americans, but we talked about a whole array of different populations who are being excluded from economic participation right now, but keep people of color from economically contributing to their communities and, broadly speaking, the country. So right now there's this huge information gathering going on. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce just released a report called By the Numbers that's available on their website. We can make that available to anybody looking right now, but they really try to distill out in a quantitative way the challenges that we all know and kind of can see. They give you some statistical data to just corroborate what we're all experiencing and witnessing.
What is the goal and who's involved in this Inequality of Opportunity Initiative? I know Rochester Chamber signed up as soon as we heard about it.
And so the goal is for business to open up a dialogue initially, because you don't want to do anything for us without us, right? So the Chamber of Commerce wants to listen. And yesterday, there was a whole host of folks who were able to give their input. So the goal is to first listen, identify those challenges, and then come up with solutions to those challenges at the communal level. So you got chambers like us, big metropolitan chambers, but you also have smaller village chambers, town chambers, maybe countywide chambers, who also have communal contributions they can make to try to eliminate some of these differentials based on race and racialized systems. And then all the way up to big chamber, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they also are a part of this conversation, and they're looking at trying to ensure that there's an $8 trillion loss of domestic GDP that the U.S. could be confronting if we don't grasp, this bull by the horns and get it to the ground sooner rather than later. And obviously, there are geopolitical power variances starting to shift. This is something that the U.S. just can't afford to turn a blind eye to. It has implications far beyond just our communities. Collectively, it could change the shape of the world.
And we're talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Inequality of Opportunity Program. Big kickoff recently with a national town hall, virtual town hall. You were in on that. What were some of your big takeaways from this town hall?
So again, the U.S. Chamber really wants us to focus on, obviously we know that there is, I guess you can say, the ethical argument of why this is the right thing to do. But what I love was, in addition to that ethical argument, they brought in folks from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to Gayle King and many others to come in and just give their opinion. They moderated a number of panels to talk about how we can unracialize the systems in the United States that continue to produce these inequalities. And really what the chamber was trying to get at this session was, in a big scheme of things, going back to that $8 trillion number by 2050, that's loss of GDP. But each and every one of our communities also seeks to lose a lot. So they bring a very logical, pragmatic dimension to the argument for why diversity, equity, and inclusion really is the way forward, especially when, as you know, Dan, we live in an era of disruption. And the comfort you might feel today that could potentially lead to complacency will cost you the competitive advantage tomorrow. So it was everything from the monetary losses that we could potentially see. It was also really starting to distill down to, the K-12 discrepancies, in that students walking into kindergarten, typically students of color, already come in with a word deficit, not having access to formal register of language and using informal register as their primary dialect that they utilize, and how that has translated to lower ELA scores. And as a system, our K-12 education system, they brought up, President Bush's famous speech where he quoted, the soft bigotry of low expectations, and how oftentimes we expect less from our communities of color to make these contributions. They talked about higher ed, credentialing. They talked about worker retention in the workplace. I mean, they touched on a whole host, wealth gaps, and even COVID, which these systems that are already racialized and that they produce racial outcomes and disparities, but typically people of color are at a disadvantage and on the wrong end or on the lesser end of those differentials. COVID has really exacerbated, how these systems have disadvantaged people of color. And now that we see that coupled with some of the brutality that we've seen from the police, there is a consensus that something needs to be done. And the chamber looked at a whole host of areas that I mentioned, from secondary, K-12, wealth gap, income disparity, you name it, profitability of entrepreneurship. I mean, you name it. We really have to investigate how do we even out the playing field and provide equal access for participation in economic life to the people of color in our communities so that they can also contribute to economic growth.
So the town hall, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Inequality of Opportunity Initiative was the first step, the launch of the program. What are the next steps?
So some of the next steps for the U.S. Chamber is that we're going to definitely keep the conversation going. There's a report that they pointed us all to from the Kellogg Foundation talking about the business case for racial equity. I'm going through it now. It is a very informative report. The Kellogg Foundation was actually the organization who provided the $8 trillion number to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so I want to investigate, what does that look like for Rochester? Annually, especially with Rock 2025, which is our local, collective impact effort right now, as we try to make ourselves a more formidable, metropolitan region to attract some outside investment, to lift people up out of poverty, to decrease our unemployment rate, and to get people gainfully employed. I'm looking at, what does that look like for Rochester? What does that number? What is inequality cost in our community annually every year now? And how can we potentially leverage some of these additional arguments and cases in addition to the ethical case, meaning that we understand that as Americans and as human beings, we all have a right to have access to become all that we have the ability to be. But in addition to that, there are so many other tools that I think the U.S. Chamber provided that's going to give workforce developers and economic developers like myself on the ground the necessary ammunition to really move this cause forward.
And you talked just a moment ago about keeping the conversation going. The Rochester Chamber has launched a new series of community conversations on race, and you've done an excellent job moderating those. What are you trying to share with the business community through these conversations?
So first and foremost, as a Black man, I am appreciative to my Chamber of Commerce community locally and nationally, even the Association for Chamber of Commerce Executives, who I'm also deeply affiliated with, for really beginning to talk about these issues. What I have the ability to do at the Greater Rochester Chamber as a Black man is recognize that nothing should be done for us, which is the Black community in Rochester, without us, which is including the various voices in the Black community, because we're not a monolith. We don't all think the same. We don't have the same interests. We don't all, necessarily want the same things. We definitely want the ability to become all that we have the potential to be, and we want that to be unrestricted and unobstructed by our identities, and more importantly, that being our race. So that's the one shared interest we do have, but then there are many communities within the Black community where those interests begin to change. And what I'm hoping we accomplish with the community conversations is by elevating these various voices, different voices in gender, socioeconomic backgrounds, political ideologies, that we really, before we act as an institution, we have an informed perspective, and we know who to partner with. We know why we're partnering. We know what the objectives are. And we can really, as an institution, be an ally in local efforts to really start to alleviate, to eradicate racial disparities within Rochester. Yesterday, I learned, just, leaning on some of the data that was presented, there's a tool called the Diversity Index, which tries to measure the amount of time and activity that different kinds of people interact with one another. We are close to the bottom in the country, about below half of where the national average is on that scale. So if you don't know what that means that if you're a white person, what that number, it tells us is that in Rochester, the probability of you interacting in an intimate way, it could be going out for drinks, having people over your house, for dinner. It could be going to the movies. It could be hanging out in the park or at a picnic. You are probably not going to do that with people who don't look like you based on that number. The probability that you interact in your personal life with folks who don't share your identity is slim to none. And that's something that we have to try to address. In work is a place we can begin to do that, and break down some of the barriers of misunderstanding, ignorance, and just a lack of knowledge and exposure, so that people can become a lot more comfortable engaging with folks outside themselves and truly see that beyond our differences, we really are just people who want many of the same things.
Definitely true. And if you're interested in participating in our community conversations on race, check out the schedule at our events calendar at greaterrochesterchamber.com. Adrian, Hale, thank you so much for sharing today.
Thanks, Dan. Always a pleasure.